The distress signal came through at 3 in the morning ship time, and Commander Lisa Morgan was already awake, because sleep had become difficult after 6 months of patrol duty in the outer sectors, where nothing ever happened until suddenly. Everything happened at once. She sat in her small quarters drinking coffee that tasted like burned metal and reading reports about pirate activity near the trade lanes, when her communication officer burst through the door without knocking, which meant something was very wrong. The young officer, whose name was Danny Cruz, looked like he had seen a ghost, and he said there was a distress call coming from the restricted zone near the Ashton Nebula, and the signal was weak, but it was definitely there. And it was broadcasting in Old Elvish, which nobody had heard in decades. Lisa set down her coffee cup and felt her heart start beating faster, because the restricted zone was called restricted, for good reasons, and the elves never asked anyone for help, especially not humans who they considered barely civilized compared to their ancient culture. She followed Danny to the bridge of the Horizon, which was a small patrol vessel designed for quick response and long-range scanning, and her crew was already at their stations looking tense and waiting for orders. Her second officer, Amy Chen, was standing at the tactical console, and she looked up when Lisa entered and said the signal was coming from coordinates that put it right in the middle of Skrull hunting territory, which explained why it was a distress call. The Skrull were insectoid raiders who had appeared 6 months ago from somewhere beyond the known sectors, and they attacked anything that moved, and their ships were covered in thick armor that made them nearly impossible to kill, and they never took prisoners or asked for surrender. Lisa walked to her command chair and sat down and asked how long it would take to reach the signal, and Amy said 20 minutes if they jumped immediately, but the regulations said they needed to report to Fleet Command first and wait for authorization. But Lisa knew that 20 minutes might already be too late, and she thought about all the reasons she should follow procedure and wait for orders, and then she thought about someone dying alone in the dark while she filled out paperwork. She told her navigator Kyle Brooks to plot the jump and prepare to engage on her mark, and Kyle grinned because he had been hoping she would say that, and his fingers flew across his console entering coordinates. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, and Lisa felt the familiar tension that came before combat, and she wondered what they would find when they arrived, and whether the Elvish ship would still be intact or just debris floating in space. She opened a ship-wide channel and told everyone to prepare for possible combat and secure all stations, and her chief engineer, Tony Park, responded immediately and said the engines were ready, and the weapons were charged and they were good to go. Lisa gave the order and the Horizon jumped and space twisted around them in a way that always made her stomach feel strange, and then they were somewhere else and alarms started screaming immediately. The main view screen showed chaos and destruction, and Lisa felt her breath catch in her throat because it was worse than she had imagined. An Elvish vessel hung in space like a broken toy, and its elegant curves were torn open, and debris floated everywhere, sparkling in the light from distant stars, and 3 massive Skrull ships circled it like sharks around wounded prey. The Elvish ship was still trying to defend itself, and Lisa could see its weapons firing, but the shots were weak and scattered, and the shields were flickering like a dying flame. Amy reported that the Elvish vessel was called the Starwind, and its power signatures were failing, and there were life signs aboard, but they were faint, and the Skrull ships were preparing to fire again. Lisa ordered Danny to open a channel to the Starwind, and for a moment there was only static, and then a face appeared on the screen that made everyone on the bridge go silent. She was an elf woman, and her features were sharp and beautiful, in a way that seemed almost unreal, and her silver hair was matted with blood and her green eyes were wide with something that looked like desperation. The elf spoke in broken human common, and her voice was rough like she had been screaming, and she said her name was Arya, and they had been transporting refugees from a colony that the Skrull had destroyed. She said their weapons were gone, and their shields were failing, and they had children aboard and injured crew. And she had 2 dragons in the cargo hold who were hurt and terrified, and she was asking the humans to help them, even though she knew the elves had never helped humans before. Lisa had heard stories about elvish dragons but never seen one because the elves kept them secret and considered them sacred, and the bond between an elf and their dragon was supposed to be deeper than family. She looked at Arya face on the screen and saw no trace of the usual elvish pride or superiority, and she understood that this woman had swallowed every bit of her culture training to ask humans for help, which meant things were truly desperate. Behind Arya on the screen, Lisa could see elvish crew members running past carrying weapons and medical supplies, and the sounds of alarms and explosions filled the background, and somewhere a child was crying. One of the Skrull ships noticed the horizon and began to turn toward them, and its weapons started glowing with sickly green light, and Amy said they had maybe 30 seconds. Before it fired, Lisa made a decision that would either save lives or get her entire crew killed, and she told Kyle to move them between the Skrull and the Starwind, and she told Amy to target the Skrull weak points and fire everything they had, told Arya to hold on because humans might be crazy, but they did not let good people die without a fight. And Arya's eyes went wide with something that might have been hope or disbelief, or both. The horizon surged forward, and Lisa gripped her chair, arms, and watched the Skrull ship grow larger on the view screen. And she thought about all the regulations she was breaking, and how Fleet Command was going to be very angry if she survived this. But then she thought about the children crying on the Starwind and the dragons who were hurt and scared, and Arya's desperate face, and she decided that some rules were worth breaking. Amy counted down from 5, and Lisa felt time slow down the way it always did before combat, and she took a deep breath and prepared to find out if human stubbornness was enough to beat Skrull armor. Amy Chen fingers moved across her tactical console like a concert pianist, and she had spent 3 years studying Skrull ship designs from recovered wreckage and grainy sensor footage, and she knew their armor had weak points where the plates connected, at the joints. The problem was hitting those weak points while the ship was moving and shooting back, and while her own ship was trying not to get blown into atoms, but Amy had always been good at difficult problems. She targeted the joint where the Skrull shipman weapon connected to its hull and fired 3 railgun shots in rapid succession, and the first shot missed by centimeters, and the second shot hit perfectly, and the third shot punched through the weakened armor and struck something important. The Skrull ship exploded in a brilliant flash of green and white light that lit up the darkness of space. Like a small sun, and debris flew outward in a perfect sphere, and the shockwave hit the horizon hard enough to make the hull groan. Lisa. Crew cheered, but she knew they did not have time to celebrate because the other 2 Skrull ships were already turning toward them, and their weapons were charging, and they looked very angry. She ordered Kyle to execute evasive pattern Delta, which was a fancy way of saying fly unpredictably and hope the enemy could not figure out where you were going before you got there. Kyle was the best pilot Lisa had ever worked with, and he flew the horizon like it was part of his own body, and the ship twisted and rolled and dove through space in patterns that would have made most people sick. Green energy bolts from the Skrull weapons cut through the space where the horizon had been moments before, and Amy returned fire whenever they had a clear shot. But the Skrull were learning, and they were starting to predict Kyle movements. Lisa opened a channel to the Starwind and told Arya they were going to send a boarding team to evacuate the wounded and retrieve the dragons. And Arya looked shocked, like she could not believe humans would risk their lives for elvish refugees and dragons they had never met. But Lisa had already made her decision, and she called down to the marine deck where Sergeant Nicole Hayes was waiting with her squad and told her to prep for emergency evacuation under fire. Nicole was a 10-year veteran who had seen combat on 4 different worlds, and she did not scare easily, but even she felt nervous about flying across open space while 3 hostile ships were shooting at everything that moved. She gathered her squad of 8 Marines, and they checked their weapons and their suit seals and their medical supplies, and Nicole told them this was a rescue mission, which meant every life counted, including their own, so nobody was allowed to die today. Her squad included her medic Tony Park, who could patch up almost any wound if you gave him enough time, and her demolitions expert Helen Grant, who was small and quiet, and could blow up a building with materials from a hardware store. There was also Bobby Chen, who was Amy's younger brother and the best shot in the unit, and Katie Walsh, who had grown up on a farm and was stronger than most men twice her size, and 4 others who were all competent and brave, and about to do something incredibly dangerous. They loaded into 2 assault pods, which were basically armored boxes with engines and minimal life support, and Nicole said a quick prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and then they launched. The pods shot out from the horizon belly and accelerated toward the damaged Starwind, and Nicole watched through the small viewport as green energy bolts streaked past them close enough to make her heart skip beats. 1 bolt hit the second pod, and alarms started screaming, but the pod kept flying and Helen's voice came over the radio saying they were still intact, but their main thruster was damaged and they would need a tow back. Nicole pod hit the Starwind hull hard enough to rattle her teeth and the magnetic clamps engaged and the cutting torch started burning through the outer hull because the normal docking ports were too damaged to use. It took 40 seconds that felt like 40 years, and then the hull gave way, and Nicole and her team pushed through into the Elvish ship, and the first thing she noticed was that everything was too tall, because elves were taller than humans on average. The second thing she noticed was the smell of smoke, and blood, and ozone, and the sound of damage. Alarms that were different from human alarms but just as urgent. An Elvish crew member appeared and he was young and terrified and he had a cut across his forehead that was bleeding into his eyes and he said something in Elvish that Nicole did not understand, but then Arya appeared running down the corridor and she looked even worse in person than she had on the view screen, and she said the dragons were in Cargo Bay 3 and the wounded were in the medical section and they had maybe 15 minutes before the ship power failed completely. Nicole split her team and sent half with Tony to handle the wounded, and she took the rest, including Bobby and Katie, toward the cargo bay where the dragons were waiting. They ran through corridors that were too tall and past rooms that were decorated with art and poetry, because even in a military ship, the elves could not help being artistic, and Nicole thought it was both beautiful and impractical. The cargo bay doors were sealed, and Arya had to use her command codes to open them. And when they finally slid apart, Nicole stopped and stared because nothing had prepared her for actually seeing dragons. They were massive and they filled the entire cargo bay, and one was deep blue like the deepest ocean and the other was emerald green like a forest after rain, and their scales seemed to glow with inner light. Both dragons were injured and bleeding from multiple wounds, and they were making sounds that Nicole felt in her chest rather than heard, and it was like standing next to huge musical instruments that were playing sad songs. Arya ran to them and knelt between their heads, and she was crying and singing something in Elvish that sounded like a lullaby or a prayer, and the dragons lowered their massive heads to press against her, and Nicole felt her throat get tight. She had been in combat for 10 years and she had seen terrible things, and she had learned to keep her emotions locked away because that was how you survived. But something about this scene broke through all her defenses. Bobby stood next to her and whispered that he had never seen anything so beautiful and sad at the same time. And Katie was already pulling out medical supplies and asking Arya where the dragons were hurt. The worst, Nicole shook herself and remembered they had a job to do and not much time to do it. And she knelt down next to Arya and said in her best command voice that they were getting everyone out alive, including these dragons, and she would personally fight anyone who said different. Arya looked at her with those impossible green eyes, and Nicole saw surprise there, because elves thought humans were violent and crude, and only cared about money and power. But here was this human woman kneeling in dragon blood and promising to save them, and Arya realized that maybe everything her people had taught her about humans was wrong. Tony Park arrived at the cargo bay 3 minutes later with half the Marine squad, and he took one look at the dragons and started cursing in 3 different languages, because his medical training had covered humans and most known alien species, but nobody had ever mentioned dragons. He pulled out his medical scanner and pointed it at the blue dragon, and the device made confused beeping sounds and displayed error messages, because dragon biology was apparently too complex for standard medical equipment. But Tony had not survived 10 years as a combat medic by giving up when things got complicated, and he knelt down next to the dragon's largest wound and studied it carefully, and decided that blood was blood, and wounds were wounds regardless of what species they belonged to. He started unpacking medical foam and coagulant patches and synthetic skin, and all the other supplies that could keep someone alive long enough to reach a real hospital, and Katie helped him while Bobby stood guard. At the door, Arya explained in broken human common that the blue dragon was named Skyfire, and the green one was named Moon Whisper, and they were bonded to her, which meant their pain was her pain. And if they died, she would probably die too. Nicole did not fully understand what bonding meant, but she understood that these dragons were not just pets or companions, but something closer to family, or maybe even parts of Arya's soul. She asked Arya if the dragons could be moved, and Arya said yes, but they were very heavy, and they would need sedation because conscious dragons were dangerous when they were frightened and in pain. Tony pulled out sedation injectors designed for large animals, And he looked at the dragons and looked at his injectors, and did some quick mental math and decided to use quadruple doses and hope for the best. He administered the sedation, and the dragons made low rumbling sounds that shook the floor, and then slowly their massive eyes began to close and their bodies relaxed, and within 5 minutes they were unconscious. Meanwhile, back on the Horizon Bridge, Lisa was running out of options because the 2 remaining Skrull ships had stopped being predictable, and they were coordinating their attacks in ways that made them much more dangerous. Kyle was still flying brilliantly, but even he could not dodge forever, and the Horizon shields were down to 30%, and the hull was taking hits, and Amy reported that they had maybe 10 minutes before critical. Systems started failing. Lisa asked Tony over the radio how much longer he needed, and Tony said they were working as fast as they could. But moving unconscious dragons was not something anyone had trained for. Amy looked up from her console and said she had an idea, but it was completely insane and probably violated several laws of physics and might blow up the ship. Lisa had learned over the years that Amy insane ideas usually worked better than anyone's safe plans, and she told her to explain. Quickly, Amy said they could redirect all remaining shield power to the forward array and channel the main reactor output directly into the railgun systems, which would give them one massive shot with enough power to do serious damage. The problem was that the ship was not designed to handle that much power, and the railguns might explode, and even if they did not explode, the recoil might tear the ship apart, and they would be completely defenseless. Afterward, Lisa looked at the view screen, where the 2 Skrull ships were moving into position for a coordinated attack that the Horizon could not survive, and she made a decision that any sane commander would have avoided. She told Amy to do it, and Amy grinned and started rerouting power, systems, and override safeties, and Kyle asked where she wanted him to position. The ship Amy did some quick calculations and told him to fly between the 2 Skrull vessels and get as close as possible, and Kyle laughed and said he always wanted to try something that's stupid down in the Starwind cargo bay. Nicole and her team had rigged a cargo sled under each dragon using straps and cables and anti-gravity modules that Tony had pulled from the Elvish ship-damaged systems. The anti-gravity modules were designed for moving heavy equipment, but Nicole hoped they would work on dragons too, and when they activated the modules, the dragons began to float a few inches off the floor. It took 6 Marines pushing and pulling to move each dragon, and they had to be very careful not to bump the dragons into walls or doors because, even unconscious, a dragon weighed several tons. Arya walked beside Skyfire with her hand on his scales, and she was still singing softly in Elvish, and Nicole noticed that the dragon seemed calmer when Arya was touching him. They got both dragons into the assault pods, which required removing most of the seats and some creative packing, but eventually they managed, and the pods were so crowded that the Marines had to stand pressed against the walls. Tony's other team had loaded the wounded Elvish crew into the second pod, and there were 12 elves total, including 3 children who stared at the human Marines with wide, frightened eyes. Nicole did a final head count and confirmed everyone was accounted for, and she told Arya they were ready to launch. And Arya took one last look at her ship, which had been her home for 7 years. The Starwind was dying, and Arya could feel it through her connection to the ship systems, and she knew they would never fly together again, and tears ran down her face as she stepped into the assault pod. Nicole gave the order to launch, and the pods detached from the Starwind and their engines fired, and they began the dangerous journey back to the Horizon while the space around them filled with weapons fire. On the Horizon Bridge, Amy announced that the railgun was charged and ready, and Lisa told Kyle to execute the attack run, and Kyle pushed the engines to maximum, and the ship surged forward. The Horizon flew straight between the 2 Skrull vessels, which was either the bravest or stupidest thing Lisa had ever ordered, and probably both at the same time. The Skrull ships were so surprised by this maneuver that they hesitated for just a moment, and that moment was all Amy needed. She targeted the empty space between the 2 enemy ships and fired the overcharged railgun, and the shot that emerged was so powerful it glowed white-hot. The railgun projectile traveled at a significant fraction of light speed, and it created a vacuum wake behind it that pulled everything nearby toward the center, and the 2 Skrull ships were caught in that wake. They tried to compensate with their engines, but the pull was too strong and they were dragged toward each other, and they collided with tremendous force, and both ships exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the entire sector. The explosion shockwave hit the horizon and threw everyone against. Their restraints and alarms screamed, and Lisa could hear metal groaning and something important broke with a sound like thunder. But they were alive, and the Skrull threat was eliminated, and Lisa looked at her crew and saw them all grinning despite the damage and the danger because they had just done something impossible. Kyle reported that the assault pods were almost back, and Lisa ordered the bay doors opened and she sent damage control teams to help with the evacuation. She stood up from her command chair and headed toward the cargo bay because she wanted to meet the people they had just risked everything to save, and she wanted to see these dragons that the elves considered so precious. The assault pods landed in the horizon cargo bay with heavy thuds that shook the deck, and the doors opened and Marines began helping wounded elves climb out, while medical teams rushed forward with stretchers and equipment. Lisa arrived just as they were unloading the first dragon, and she stopped in her tracks because seeing a dragon on a view screen was completely different from standing 10 feet away from one in real life. Skyfire was still unconscious, but even sleeping he radiated a kind of power that made the air feel heavy, and his blue scales caught the light in ways that seemed impossible, and Lisa understood why the elves considered them sacred. Moonwhisper was being carefully maneuvered out of the second pod, and her green scales were darker than Skyfire blue ones, and she had a scar across her shoulder that looked old, and there was intelligence in her face, even while sedated Arya climbed out of the pod, and she looked exhausted and covered in blood and ash, but her eyes went immediately to her dragons and she moved toward them with her hands outstretched, like she needed to touch them to believe they were safe. Nicole appeared beside Lisa, and she was limping slightly and had a new burn mark on her armor, but she was grinning and she said all the refugees were accounted for, and the dragons would live if they got proper medical attention. Soon Lisa asked if Nicole was injured, and Nicole waved off the concern and said it was just a minor burn from some falling debris, and she had experienced worse during training exercises. The three elvish children were standing together near the pod door, looking frightened and overwhelmed, and Katie Walsh knelt down to their level and started showing them her helmet and making funny faces to get them to smile. One of the children was brave enough to reach out and touch Katie's armor, and Katie let her and started explaining in simple words what each piece of equipment did, and gradually the child fear began to fade. Tony was already setting up a temporary medical area in the corner of the cargo bay, because the Horizon small medical bay could not handle this many patients, and he was triaging the wounded elves with practiced efficiency. Most of the injuries were minor cuts and burns, but 2 elves had serious wounds that needed immediate surgery, and Tony was preparing to operate right there in the cargo bay because moving them was too dangerous. Arya finally reached her dragons and placed her hands on Skyfire's massive head, and closed her eyes, and Lisa saw her lips moving in silent prayer. Or maybe she was communicating with the dragon through their bond. After a moment, Arya opened her eyes and turned to look at Lisa, and their gazes met across the crowded bay, and Lisa saw something shift in Arya's expression. The elvish woman walked toward Lisa with slow, careful steps like she was approaching something sacred or dangerous, and when she reached Lisa, she stopped, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Arya did something that shocked everyone in the cargo bay and made several elves gasp out loud, because it went against every tradition of her people. She knelt down on the deck in front of Lisa and placed her right hand over her heart in the traditional elvish gesture of life debt, and she said in clear human common that her life and the lives of her people and her dragons now belonged to Lisa. Lisa felt uncomfortable because she had not done this to earn debts or gratitude, but simply because it was the right thing to do. And she reached down to help Arya stand up. But Arya would not stand until Lisa acknowledged the debt, and Lisa realized this was important to elvish culture and honor. So she placed her own hand over her heart and said she accepted Arya gratitude, but no debt was owed between people who helped each other. Arya stood up and there were tears running down her face, and she said her people had been wrong about humans for a very long time. She explained that elves taught their children that humans were dangerous because they did not follow the old rules and did not respect traditions and fought in ways that seemed chaotic and brutal. But now Arya understood that humans were dangerous for a completely different reason, and it was because they refused to let good people die, even when it was not their fight, and they would break their own ships and risk their own lives for strangers. She said that was a kind of strength her people had forgotten, And maybe that was why the elves were losing their war against the Skrull, while humans kept surviving against impossible odds. Lisa did not know what to say to that, so she just nodded and suggested they focus on getting everyone medical attention and figuring out their next steps. Samey's voice came over the ship-wide speakers and announced that the Horizon engines were damaged and life support was running on backup power, and they needed to reach a repair station soon, or they would be stranded. The nearest human station was 3 days away at their current speed, but there was an elvish outpost called Haven Point that was only 6 hours away if they could limp there. Lisa looked at Arya and asked if Haven Point would allow a human ship to. Doc and Arya said she was a high captain in the elvish fleet, and her word carried weight. And yes, they would be allowed. Lisa made the decision to head for Haven Point, and she sent Kyle back to the bridge to plot a course and told her engineering team to keep the ship together long enough to get them there. Over the next hour, the cargo bay became organized chaos as Tony and his medical team worked on the wounded, and the dragons began to wake up from sedation. Skyfire opened his eyes first, and they were deep gold like sunlight, and he made a sound that was part growl and part musical note, and everyone in the bay felt it vibrate through their bones. Arya rushed to his side and placed her forehead against his and whispered something in Elvish, and the dragon relaxed and turned his massive head to look at the humans around him. Lisa stood very still as those golden eyes focused on her, and she felt like Skyfire was looking through her and seeing everything she had ever done, and ever been, and judging whether she was worthy. Then Skyfire made a different sound that was softer and almost gentle, and Arya smiled for the first time since the rescue and said the dragon approved of Lisa and wanted to thank her. Lisa did not know how to thank a dragon, so she just nodded respectfully, and Skyfire closed his eyes again, but this time he seemed peaceful rather than unconscious. Moon Whisper woke up shortly after, and her reaction was more cautious, and she watched the humans with suspicious green eyes that matched Arya's own until her bonded elf came to reassure her. The 3 elvish children had fallen asleep, curled up together on some cargo blankets, and Katie had appointed herself their guardian and sat nearby, cleaning her weapons while keeping one eye on them. Bobby Chen brought coffee for everyone, and Lisa gratefully accepted a cup and stood with Nicole and Amy, discussing what would happen when they reached Haven Point. Nicole pointed out that this rescue might have started something bigger than just saving one ship, and Amy agreed and said the alliance between humans and elves could change the balance of power in the entire sector. Lisa hoped they were right, because the Skrull were not going to stop attacking, and if humans and elves could learn to work together, they might actually have a chance to survive what was coming. The journey to Haven Point took 8 hours instead of 6 because the Horizon engines kept failing, and the engineering team had to make emergency repairs 3 times while they limped through space. During that time, Lisa crew and the elvish refugees began to interact in awkward but genuine ways that surprised everyone involved. The 3 elvish children, whose names were Lyra and Finn and Kale, had recovered from their initial fear and were now following Katie Walsh everywhere like baby ducks. Following their mother, Katie taught them card games and let them try on her helmet and showed them pictures of her family farm back on Earth, and the children laughed for the first time in days. Bobby Chen discovered that one of the elvish refugees, named Elian, had been a musician before the war, and they spent 2 hours discussing music theory and comparing human and elvish instruments. Tony Park worked alongside an elvish healer named Theron, who knew herbal medicines that Tony had never heard of, and together they developed new treatments that combined human technology with elvish natural remedies. Even the dragons seemed to relax as they healed, and Skyfire let Nicole pet his scales after she brought him water, and Moon Whisper allowed Amy to sit nearby while she worked on calculations for the railgun system. Arya spent most of the journey on the Horizon Bridge with Lisa, learning about human military tactics and ship operations, and sharing information about Skrull attack patterns that the elves had documented. She explained that the Skrull had appeared 6 months ago from a region of space that even elvish long-range sensors could not penetrate, and they attacked without warning or negotiation and took no prisoners. The elves had lost 12 colonies and hundreds of ships trying to fight them, and their traditional warfare tactics that relied on shields and energy weapons were ineffective against Skrull. Armor Lisa showed Arya the combat recordings from their fight and explained how human railguns used kinetic energy instead of energy beams, and how targeting weak points was more effective than trying to overwhelm the armor area. Watched the recordings with intense focus and asked technical questions that showed she understood military strategy better than most human officers Lisa had met. When they finally approached Haven Point, Lisa was surprised to see it was not a military station, but a beautiful structure that looked like it had been grown from crystal, rather than built from metal. The station was surrounded by gardens that somehow existed in the vacuum of space inside transparent domes, and there were ships of elegant design docked at various ports, and everything looked artistic and peaceful. Arya transmitted her identification codes and explained the situation, and within minutes they received clearance to dock and a promise of full repair services and medical care for everyone aboard. As the Horizon slowly maneuvered into the docking bay, Lisa saw Elvish officials waiting, and she noticed their expressions were a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, because human ships rarely came to Elvish stations. The docking process took longer than usual, because the bay was designed for Elvish. Ships in the Horizon did not quite fit properly, but eventually they sealed the connection and the doors opened. An Elvish delegation came aboard, led by a tall man with silver hair and robes that seemed to shimmer with their own light. And his name was High Commander Varen, and he was Arya. Superior Officer Varen looked shocked when he saw the condition of the Starwind survivors, and even more shocked when he saw the dragons lying in the cargo bay, and his eyes went very wide when Arya explained that humans had rescued them all. He turned to Lisa and studied her for a long moment, and Lisa stood straight and met his gaze without flinching, because she had done nothing wrong and had no reason to feel inferior. Then Varen did something that made his entire delegation gasp, and he bowed deeply, which was apparently a big deal in Elvish culture, because several of his officers looked like they might faint. He said in perfect human common that the Elvish people owed humanity a debt that could never be fully repaid, and he offered sanctuary to Lisa and her crew for as long as they wished to stay. He also said that he wanted to discuss a formal alliance between humans and elves because the war against the Skrull was not going well, and they needed new strategies and new allies. Lisa accepted his offer and suggested they start by sharing intelligence about the Skrull and combining their military resources, and Varen agreed immediately. Over the next few days, Haven Point became a hub of activity as human and Elvish engineers worked together to repair the Horizon, and military officers from both species met to plan joint operations. The Elvish children started attending classes at the station school, where they met Elvish and human children, and they told everyone about the brave humans who had saved them. Nicole and her Marines trained with Elvish warriors and discovered that combining human aggression with Elvish precision created fighting techniques that were more effective than either species had developed alone. Tony and Theron published a joint paper on treating radiation burns that became required reading in both human and Elvish medical academies. Amy spent hours with Elvish scientists studying their shield technology and explaining human railgun mechanics, and together, they designed hybrid systems that were better than anything either species had created separately. The dragons recovered fully, and Skyfire and Moonwhisper became minor celebrities at the station, because they were the first dragons most elves had seen in years, since the bonded pairs usually stayed far from public spaces. Arya spent time with Lisa every day, and they became friends in a way that transcended species and culture, and they talked about their lives and their hopes and their fears about the war. Lisa learned that Arya had lost her family to a Skrull attack 3 months ago, and the dragons were all she had left, and that was why she had been so desperate to save them. Arya learned that Lisa had joined the military because she wanted to explore space and protect people, and she had never expected to start a war or change history. 2 weeks after their arrival, High Commander Varen called a formal assembly and invited both human and Elvish officials, and he stood in front of everyone and made an announcement. He said that the rescue of the Starwind had proven that humans and elves were stronger together than apart, and he was proposing a formal military alliance with shared command and combined forces. He said the alliance would be called the Free People's Coalition, and it would be dedicated to defending all peaceful species from threats like the Skrull. The proposal was approved by both human and Elvish governments within days because everyone could see that cooperation was the only path to survival. Lisa was promoted to captain, and given command of a joint task force that included both human and elvish ships, and Nicole became her executive. Officer Aria was assigned as the elvish liaison, and she brought Skyfire and Moonwhisper with her, because the dragons refused to be separated from the humans who had saved them. The task force's first mission was to patrol the border regions and respond to distress calls from any species that needed help, and to hunt Skrull raiders, as Lisa stood on the bridge of her new ship with her mixed human and elvish crew. She thought about how one distress call had changed everything. She thought about how easy it would have been to ignore that signal or to follow regulations and wait for authorization, but she had chosen to act, and that choice had saved lives and started friendships and created an alliance that might save the entire galaxy. Area stood beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder and said that humans had taught the elves an important lesson about courage and compassion. Lisa smiled and said the elves had taught humans about honor and beauty and working together. Below, in the cargo, Skyfire and Moonwhisper rested peacefully, and the three children played with human and elvish friends and marines from both species trained together. The galaxy was still dangerous, and the Skrull were still out there, and there would be more battles and more losses. But now humans and elves faced those threats together. And that made all the difference, because sometimes the bravest thing anyone could do was reach out across the darkness and answer when someone called for help.